Welcome everyone to another segment of One-on-One Live at 2. The episode's brought to you from R. Michelson Galleries in Northampton, Massachusetts. Please feel free to visit us on our website at rmichelson.com. That's RMICHELSON.com. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, my name is Ilana. I work at R. Michelson Galleries, and this is the series that brings you just a little bit closer to some of your favorite illustrators and authors. Today, I am joined by Mr. Matthew Cordell. Hi, Matt, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining us, and on all days, thank you for joining us on a day where we are celebrating graduation and education and literacy and all that jazz. How are you holding up with all this?
Holding up pretty well, I would say. I'm used to being inside and sort of a solitary existence, being a freelance author and illustrator. And I fortunately I live in an area where we don't have to stay inside. You know, I can go outside. I live in a suburb of Chicago, and it's about an hour north of Chicago. So it's a suburb. So there's, chain restaurants and that sort of thing. But if you drive a few minutes away, there's really great forest preserves and great places to hike and get outside. So I try to do that every morning, and it's been a really a blessing to have that right now, because if I couldn't do anything, then I would definitely be going stir crazy.
But crazy.
Yeah, I've been lucky in that way.
Well, thank you for joining us. For those who have not participated or watched one of these before, let me fill you in a little bit. In this segment, what we do is we receive your questions all week long, and then we ask them live on air to the illustrator or artist. And if you were not able to send a question, feel free to just write one in those comments, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So why don't we dive right on in? You ready, Matt?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Let's do it. All right. Our first question is from Michelle.
Okay.
And I'm just going to give a little bit of background because everyone may not be as familiar with you. Matt, you studied graphic design, is that correct?
Yeah, so I went to school and my major was in graphic design, but I also, I've always been an artist in different ways. I grew up loving to draw. So even in college, I was taking, drawing classes, printmaking classes, painting classes. So it was never my intention just to live a life as a graphic designer. And even when I graduated from college, I worked as a designer for a while and realized pretty quickly that I didn't like the world of graphic design, the business world as much. I liked the work. I still love and appreciate really great typography and graphic design, but I just didn't love being in that corporate world, as much.
Yeah.
So I was sort of trying everything that I could do to become a freelance artist. And that's sort of around the time I was reintroduced to children's book illustration, which was a real gift to me at that point. My wife, who was a school librarian, she kind of helped me realize how wonderful picture books are. So that's how it kind of got started for me.
So Michelle is wondering, graphic design has a reputation, I think, for really clean lines. It's very vector-based graphics. And she is wondering if it was difficult, essentially, to break free from those constraints, because your illustrations tend to be much more spontaneous. They tend to be fluid. They're almost scribbly with a lot of life. Sure. Was it difficult to sort of break that mentality of the graphic design world?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because design is really about control and tight lines. And it was an interesting contrast for me, because the artwork that I was making in those years and even before was very scribbly and scratchy and gestural and expressive in those ways. So the drawing and painting I was doing was a lot closer, at least in terms of application and some art supplies I was using, to what I do. The design, I would even try in my design background. I always like to make things as rough as possible. I like to bring in drawing, and I like to bring it, play with the type and make it sort of, more expressive in certain ways. But I also did like the sharpness of type. And so it was an interesting, contrast in some ways, because I did, towards the end of my design career, I mean, I guess I still consider myself a designer in some ways, working in picture books. But towards the end of my professional, design undertaking, I was becoming more of a tighter designer.
Yeah.
But in terms of drawing and painting, I've always loved to get messy and scribbly and scratchy. And those are the type of artists who I've always been drawn to as well, in the fine art world and in illustration as well. So yeah, I think maybe that was ultimately what drove me out. One of the reasons I was driven out of design is because it was too controlled, and I just wanted to get messy and be in my studio,
Yeah. So you mentioned very quickly, and again, for those who either just joined us or who missed the story, so Matt had no intention really of becoming a children's book illustrator, and it wasn't until your wife and author Julie Halpern, who was a librarian at the time, I believe, convinced you by bringing home books. Can you tell us, do you remember any of the books that she brought home
yeah, I do.
to you, and what prompted you to finally make that leap into illustration?
Yeah, so so at the time when I met Julie, I was living in Chicago. Now we live in a suburb of Chicago, but maybe I said that already. We lived in the city, and I was working as a designer, and I was also showing, drawings and paintings in galleries in Chicago. And around the same time is when I got sort of burned out, and I just didn't love design as much. And I didn't love the fine art world as much in a different way. It was just kind of too like pretentious, I guess, or it was maybe too, I just wasn't very good at selling myself in the fine art world, I think is what it was. And so Julie that's when I met her, and she's a writer as well. And she had this idea. She said, why don't you and I, make a picture book together? We'll try to get it published. And at that time, I had no knowledge of picture books, and I, had memories, but some of my memories were that, picture books could be this sort of message driven, corny, sappy, uncool way of being an artist. And so I wasn't very excited about that idea at first. And so she started kind of feeding me, a lot of her books from her childhood. And some of it, was stuff that I still love today. And, it's William Steig, Arnold Lobel, Bernard Weber, a lot of that stuff that, I think she was showing me the things that she knew that I would like, really. Quentin Blake. And so it was stuff that was scribbly and scratchy and really loose, which is the type of art I was making at the time. It looked different from what I'm doing now, but it was really loose, drawings and paintings. And then she showed me some contemporary books as well, like, Olivia, which is really beautifully drawn.
Yeah.
And I just was thinking, it just changed my perspective completely. And at that point, I was like, yeah, let's really try to do this. But we had no concept. Neither one of us had been published, and we had no idea how difficult it can be. So we made a proposal and sent it to like 20 publishers all at the same time. And like little by little, we would get these rejection letters one after the next. And it was the very last letter came in from Houghton Mifflin. And they said, oh, this looks kind of interesting. It wasn't like a concrete yes. So there was some work that needed to be done before they would agree to it. So Julie was working on the manuscript for a few months, and then they decided to publish it. And so that book was called Toby and the Snowflakes. Came out in 2004, kind of a sleeper hit.
And something that can still be found.
Yeah, well, it's out of print, unfortunately, but I'm sure the hardcore.
You can still find it if you really want to.
Exactly. Yeah, there are ways to find it. And then once I worked with a publisher, and once I got to see, what it's like to make picture books and to draw for kids and draw for families, it totally changed my world. And that was the only thing that I wanted to do. So I was still working in design and printing actually at the time. And I just kept trying to get more and more illustration work. And then eventually, as an author and an illustrator, it took me about 7 years till I had the confidence to, quit my full-time job and do this full-time. And that was, I think I quit my job in 2007. It was, yeah. Well, quit my job. I still have a job, right? Obviously, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it.
You did a pivot. You shifted directions.
Yeah.
Matt, we're going to go to some of our first live questions, and then we'll go back to the email questions. And I do want to take a quick opportunity just to let everyone know I received a lot of questions today asking if it was okay to send a question in and then watch the video later, because I believe we have a little bit of competition at 2 o'clock right now. So I just want to let everyone know for all future broadcasts.
The nerve of this guy.
The nerve, unbelievable. For all future broadcasts, always feel free to send those questions. We'll try to get to those, but let's head over to some of the live ones. Matt, Sarah is wondering, she says she loves your bird pictures on Instagram, and she's wondering if you have any plans for a bird-centric book.
Yeah, well, thanks for following along the bird adventures I've been going on here in the last several months. I don't have anything like definitive, but I do want to make some sort of bird watching story. And so this is how it usually starts for me. I don't really get any story. Sometimes I'll get a story idea, but this is not one of those cases. So right now I'm just getting sort of images in my head. I've got a little bit of sort of a cloudy idea of what could happen, what a sort of story I could tell with bird watching. And so I definitely want to, but I haven't. It's not in a place where I can do it yet, but it's definitely, I'm going to make it happen, one way or another. So I'm thinking about it a lot. Yeah.
So stay tuned, Sarah, is the main point. Stay tuned. Mm-hmm. We have another live question from Nancy, who is wondering, how does your process differ when you are the author of a book as opposed to when you are illustrating somebody else's words?
Yeah, good question. So in some ways, when I'm the author, it's a little bit easier to be an illustrator, because as I'm writing it, I'm already kind of sketching it out in my head. So by the time I'm actually drawing it, I have a pretty good picture of what the characters should look like in the background and color to some degree. When I'm illustrating someone else's book, someone else's manuscript, I come in on it sort of later in the game, and I have to sit with it and think about it more. And a lot of times as I'm reading it, I'll jot down some notes into the margins of the manuscript about what might happen here. And then I have to start with character sketches. So that's what I do first, and figure out what the characters are going to be, what they're going to look like, and what sort of clothes they're going to be wearing, if they're going to be people or animals, all that sort of thing. And so there's a little bit more planning that has to be done when I'm working with a different author on a book. So, but a lot of times I've done so many books that I've illustrated with authors and author friends that I still really get excited more to some degree. No offense to any of my author friends, but I haven't really gotten my fill of writing and illustrating my own book. So there's a little bit more, maybe I shouldn't be acknowledging this, but there is a little bit more excitement, that builds in me when I'm thinking about a story that's been in my head for so long,
Right.
So yeah, but it is exciting too to illustrate someone else's story, because, well, it's exciting, but it's also it can be a little, daunting in respect of hoping that they like what I do. When I'm illustrating my own stories, I only have to answer to myself in that respect. So so there's a little bit more pressure. It's sort of an unspoken pressure. No one's ever said, this better be good. It's never been that. But so yeah, it is different, but in some ways it's the same. Deadlines and the different deadlines where you have to deliver sketches and final art. And so it all feeds into the same good spots.
So I'd like to actually sort of touch upon that, the collaboration. You have a wonderful friendship and also working relationship with some of our other friends, Philip Stead, and you can see Philip and his wife Erin's work at rmichelson.com. We represent both. But aside from a working relationship, you happen to have a friendship with the Steads as well. Last week, we were lucky enough to talk with Mark Teague, who sort of walked us through the process of when an author and an illustrator collaborate on a book. They often don't actually collaborate that much. In fact, a lot of the work is done through editors and whatnot. I'm wondering, what's it like to collaborate with a friend, and how does that process differ because of your friendship and relationship?
Yeah, good question. So with Phil, we met each other at an ALA conference many years ago. I met Phil and Erin, and just have stayed in touch with them, and met, a lot of times I think these friendships develop in a lot of the similar ways where you see people out traveling and at author events and conferences. And so I've I really like them. They're great people.
They're great.
And Phil and I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I think what happened, they work a lot with Neil Porter, and I met Neil through the Steads. And I kept thinking, I kept saying to Phil, with Neil, I want to do something with Neil, and he said, well, Phil said, maybe I could write, not me, but Phil said he could maybe write something and I could illustrate it. And then the three of us could, which didn't occur to me, but I really would have loved to work with Phil as well in that capacity. I knew that he wrote, but he'd only written really he writes and illustrates his own books, but the only thing he's written that someone else illustrated was when Erin did it. So
right.
I didn't even think that was something he would want to do, but he suggested it, and he sent me a manuscript, and I loved it. That was called Special Delivery, that book. And and then so we talked to Neil about it, and so it was a very different way of working, because I wanted Phil to be involved in the artistic process as well, because he's a friend and he's also an illustrator himself. And so from the very beginning, this is some sort of this is sort of unorthodox, where you don't really, I don't know if people know this or not, some of the people who might be watching this, authors and illustrators do not typically work together. The editor, the art director usually is right in the middle, and so they handle any correspondence that might need to take place. But Phil, Neil, and I were constantly in touch. The three of us, we would have these really long conversations on the phone, and I sent them the sketches at the same time, and we would just talk these really long, really fun, collaborative conversations about what was working, what wasn't working. And so all the books that I've done with Phil and Neil have played out like that. So we've done 2 books. We did a special delivery and a sequel to that called The Only Fish in the Sea. And we just finished,
behind me.
Oh yeah, we just finished a 3rd book that and my mind is like totally shot right now. It's going to be called why can't I remember the title? This is terrible. Let me think. It's going to be called, anyway, it's a third, it's going to be a trilogy at this point, and it's the 3rd book that involves the same characters. Sadie.
And for those who are interested to see these illustrations, you can see all the illustrations from both books right on rmichelson.com, which is rmichelson.com. And I do highly recommend looking at them, especially just to see sort of the fluidity that arcs over both books. And now I'm really excited to see the 3rd.
Yeah.
So we're going to go now to a question from Rob, who says, your style is incredibly refreshing in its bounciness and movement. But as an artist, I find it really hard to capture the movement and the spontaneity. And you are able to do it really just with pen and ink, which, again, go look at those illustrations. Is this something that comes naturally to you? Do you do tons of sketches first, or do you illustrate on top of pencil drawings?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's an important part for me too, to look as sort of fresh and free as possible. And it's hard for me, because sometimes when I make a sketch, the sketch is almost perfect to me. So when I try to make the pen and ink final artwork of a pencil sketch, it just bothers me to no end, because it's impossible to really recreate the what you love about an initial drawing, preparatory drawing. But the way I do it is I don't draw right on the paper. That I don't draw in pencil. I print my sketches out like as dark as possible. So they're pencil sketches, but I make them black in Photoshop, and then I use a light table. So I put my watercolor paper on top of the printed out sketch so that I can see it a little bit, but not completely. And then I'm not so hung up on trying to recreate that sketch when I'm redrawing it. I can see enough of it to know how it needs to be reproduced. But yeah, it's something that I think anyone who wants to draw in a very loose and sketchy and sort of free way, it's hard, because sometimes that first sketch is really satisfying, and then when you go in to redraw it, it's disappointing, and sometimes I end up redrawing it a lot of times in ink, if I can't get enough of if it doesn't satisfy me enough to the point of the way that the sketch did. So that's kind of the unseen part of when you work in a way that people might dismiss as being really fast or unaccomplished maybe, is that there's a lot of stuff that goes in the trash, like you keep doing it over and over until it's a point where you feel it's a success. And even then it's like, I'm the type of person that's so critical, so self-critical. Sometimes it's hard for me to look at older drawings, especially. But when you really get it right, it really hits the right spot for you.
So we actually also received a question from Natalie, who was also quite curious about how you became so comfortable drawing in pen and ink. And she is wondering, do you have any practices that you have found particularly helpful to improve your pen and ink work?
Yeah, I think something that has really helped me is I keep a sketchbook, and I draw with ink. I have some sketchbooks right here, and it's a pretty small sketchbook. It's a watercolor sketchbook. It's a moleskin watercolor sketchbook, and I draw in ink. And it's I use a fountain pen because sometimes when I take these sketchbooks out, I don't want to bring, obviously my dip pen and my bottle of ink, and it's just too awkward. And this is just immediate, it has a waterproof ink in it. It's a certain type of fountain pen ink that you can charge with waterproof ink. So I can actually do watercolor on top of the drawing. So I draw in ink like this, and I don't do any sketches. I don't do any pencil underneath. And there's something really helpful to me about just drawing right away in ink and just being comfortable with whatever happens, So sometimes the ink drawing can be a horrible disaster, and I'll just draw over it and over it and over it until it looks good to me. I've done that a lot of times in my sketchbook, or sometimes I might break out like some white, gouache or something. And it's just keeping a sketchbook or a drawing book where it's not an illustration that is for an assignment, and there's no expectation other than your own expectations. I find that daily, somewhat, semi-daily practice of doing that is really freeing, and it really just makes you feel good inside to like make something new, somewhat as close to every day as I can get it, depending on how busy I am. But doing that is really helpful. And so I actually have this when I post drawings like that on Instagram, and I don't do any pencil work. I'll try to show you some more as I'm talking.
We love this.
A lot of these are from some, my bird walks, and are just things that like when I was out walking with my kids one day, I took some pictures, and some of it's sort of like diary type drawing. I was at the Art Institute one day, and I just, drew one of the lions out there. But I forgot what thought track I was on there, but I think it all really makes you more comfortable with the pen when you draw with a pen every day. And this is a different type of pen than I use for my final art for my picture books. I use dip pens like these, nib pens, and waterproof India ink. But you get a feel. I think there's a fear that develops if you don't draw with a pen every day, like the permanence of ink. If you let too long of a time go where you haven't drawn with a pen, there's a hesitance that builds up in me when I sit down to draw with a pen and with some ink again, and I haven't done it for a while. But if I do it somewhat regularly, it sort of breaks the ice a lot easier.
Well, Natalie, I hope that answers your questions, and it seems like one of the best practices is just keep on drawing every single day. Just draw.
Yeah.
Matt, I want to ask you, so You've illustrated both wordless books and books with text. And I want to start getting into some of the books. But before we do that, what I really would like to know is, do you have a preference between illustrating something that is wordless as opposed to something that has the text and the story outlined? What is your preference as you've done both?
Yeah, I don't really have a preference. I think in terms of the books that I've done that have been wordless or, minimal with words, those books have evolved in that direction.
Interesting.
I haven't, there's only one book that I did that was wordless, started out wordless. And that was a book, my last, well, let's see, it came out in the fall of last year, Explorers it's called. But other than that, I would say like Wolf in the Snow, that started out with traditionally written, with text. And
interesting.
I just felt like as the story evolved, as it changed and the manuscript changed, I was taking out more and more words because the story doesn't need words really. You have these two characters that are isolated in nature. They don't speak the same language, so there's not dialogue in that way, and it just made more sense that it didn't need words, and that it would also pump up the volume of the drama of the book if it didn't have something, sort of a narrator explaining what was happening. It was almost like you're part of what's happening because you're not reading it, you just have to experience it. So I had, that was my first, like strictly, I would say, wordless book. I did a book called Hello, Hello that was somewhat wordless, but there was still some dialogue and there were still some things happening that I don't really think of that book as much as a wordless book. But so I do love wordless books, and they're a bit harder. They're beautiful and I love them, but I've discovered they can be a bit harder to sell people on that aren't familiar with picture books as much. Some people don't even understand that there's a whole like world of wordless picture books, so that when they see yours, it's like, it's sort of disturbing that this book has no words and they don't know how to read it to an audience or to a child. And so it's a little bit of a struggle, which I wasn't anticipating. So I do love them, and I love to talk about them, and I love to sing the praises of wordless books. But I also like variety. I really love variety in life in all forms, even in the art that I make and the stories that I tell. So I've done a couple wordless books. So now I'm kind of moving back into, traditional text, and my newest book actually is my first nonfiction book. So I like to do different things. I like to mix it up. So
we're going to get into the newest book in a second, but before we do, I did have another question from Marie. If you don't know, so Wolf in the Snow, which is directly behind me, won the 2018 Caldecott. And Marie would like to know, what was it like finding out that you had won the Caldecott medal? Did you ever consider that your book would even be a contender? What was that moment like for you?
Yeah, it was it's one of my favorite things to talk about, really, because it was so surprising. It was one of the most surprising moments of my whole life. One of the most satisfying, and besides get my wedding day and birth of my children. It was like one of the craziest, just unsettling in the best way, moments of my life. And the way the Caldecott works is that there's no nomination, there's no open nomination process. Like, for instance, with the Oscars or Academy Awards, who's been narrowed down to. So any book that's been published with that calendar year, in theory, has a shot at this big award. There's something get in your head, when a lot of people with the social media these days, a lot of people make these lists, the best books of the year, and And a lot of the big media outlets do that as well. New York Times and a lot of our review journals do that. So if your book lands on a lot of those lists, it starts to seep into your subconscious that it's possible, you know, that, and you hope like your book is becoming more and more visible, and people are appreciating it from all corners, and you wonder like, and the Caldecott is the last stop on that whole road of awards and
journey
accolades.
of accolades.
It's always the last stop, so it sort of builds up to this peak, you know. It's the last and biggest stop, I would say. So I'm very superstitious, and I would never want to acknowledge that there was a possibility it could happen. I never wanted to even say the word Caldecott in a conversation. But it was always sort of there, you know, and so the night before is the worst night ever, because you know the whole like lore of the Caldecott or any of the big awards is that usually early, either late that night, but I think with the big awards you find out the morning of, and really early you get a phone call. And I was laying in bed, and I woke up at about 3 or 4 in the morning, and then I just like as soon as my eyes popped open, it was the first thing I thought about, and I couldn't fall back asleep, and the hours were just kind of slowly like creeping by, and it got to about like 7 or 7:30 a.m. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning, my time, Central Time. And I hadn't had a call. And at that point, I was just thinking, I was like swearing the universe, you know, I was crushed, you know, already. And then about 7:30 a.m., my phone rang, and I looked at the caller ID, and it said Colorado Convention Center, which is where the conference was. You know, the calls come from the conference, the ALA conference that's happening. And I knew like, oh my gosh, something's, you don't know, because it could be anything. It could be any award really, or it could be, and I answered the phone, and the woman on the other line said, she said, is this Matt Cordell? Is this Matthew Cordell? And I said, yeah. And she said, do you like to be called Matt or Matthew? And I'm like, I don't care, you know, just call me whatever you want. What is this about? And then she goes, okay, well, this is Tish Wilson. I'm the chair of the Caldecott committee, the Randolph Caldecott committee. And then I'm thinking already like, oh my gosh, already I'm like stoked, you know, like it could be an Caldecott honor, and I would just be like, I would be on my knees, you know. And then she said this really long thing, and I don't even remember exactly the wording, but she said, your book, Wolf in the Snow, is being awarded the 2018 Randolph J. Caldecott.
Oh my goodness.
It's like a really long formal thing. And I'm just sort of like stunned for a second. And I said, is that the gold one or the silver one? And then the whole committee was on, there was a conference call, and I could just hear them cheering on the other line. And I just like, and, you know, they said, you know, we're really, really happy for you. We love your book. And I still get goosebumps when I talk about it. I can talk about it any amount of times. And it was just so exciting. And I was just so grateful, you know, like, and then you know, I couldn't say anything for a couple of hours. They said, you know, don't tell anyone, because we haven't made the formal announcement. And so we couldn't talk about it. So I asked, we called our kids' schools, and my wife and I were like, you know, Romy has a doctor's appointment, right? And then we sat around and watched the awards.
Oh.
The awards, the live webcast, and
what a special moment.
And then everything just, it was like a windfall of phone calls and texts and, you know, alerts, and it was really just such a blissful, it still is, you know. I still think about it. Sometimes I, you know, it doesn't occur to me, and I'll just be, you know, I don't know, something will pop into my head, and I'll just be like, you know, I want my book is a Caldecott medal winning book, because it's like a rarefied occurrence, you know, when you think about many books, how many different illustrators books have won that that acclaim. I just still feel so grateful and blessed, and just astonished that it happened to me, you know. So yeah, it's amazing.
For those whoever wanted to own an original Matthew Cordell, and I will mention, while we talk about Wolf in the Snow, we actually, believe it or not, somehow we have just a few pieces remaining still. They are all studies from this Caldecott winning book. But if you go to rmichelson.com, you can see the ones that are left, and I believe they're the only illustrations still left. Matt, I do want to talk. At first, I want to congratulate you. You just had the release date earlier this month for your newest book, and I'm going to move on only because we are actually also getting questions about your newest book, which is called Hello Neighbor, The Kind and Caring World of Mr. Rogers. It was released, I believe, early May. Is that correct?
May 5th, yeah.
May 5th. And this is, you heard it first right here on this broadcast. For all of you who are watching, I wanted to let you all know that our Michelson Galleries will in fact be receiving some of these studies and original drawings from the book. And since you're watching and heard it first, if you send us an email right now to either the email listed, the events at rmichelson.com, what we are doing is we are beginning to compile a list so that as soon as those illustrations arrive at that gallery front door, what we'll do is we'll send out an email alert and give all of our viewers sort of first dibs before they go out public. So make sure to email if you are interested in seeing those illustrations before anyone else. Matt, this seemed like it was a passion project for you. You even contacted the Fred Rogers Productions to work with them on creating this authorized biography picture book. I'm curious, why was this such an important project for you? What role did Fred Rogers play in your life?
Yeah, so I grew up, I was born in 1975, so I grew up in sort of one of the big, you know, that was, Mr. Rogers was going strong, you know, yes. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So it was a big part. It was really a special place, a special program for me as a preschooler, as a toddler. And there was you know, once you grow out of something like that, you're still aware that it happened, and you think of it in a sort of warm, nostalgic way. But you know, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, he wasn't really part of my, you know, daily thoughts or anything. Mm-hmm. And then when I became a dad, my daughter was born in 2008. And she got old enough to, you know, start watching a little television and stuff. We would have PBS Kids on, and I was home one day alone with her one afternoon, and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came on just randomly, like an old rerun. You know, it's not shown on every PBS channel these days, but our Milwaukee affiliate I think they still show it occasionally at certain times. And it came on, and when that opening song came on, it was like, you know, it was over here, and it just, like, my head just snapped, you know, like over there, like, wow, what a flashback that was, you know, what a wonderful flashback it was. You know, I was thinking about my childhood and how special that was to me. And, you know, Sesame Street has endured, you know, so it's been there this whole time, but I hadn't really thought about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in so long. And I sat down and I watched it, you know, and it just gave me all these, it was like all the feels, you know. It was a lot of wonderful memories, but at the same time, I was watching it as an adult, you know, and as a parent, a somewhat new parent. Mm-hmm. And I was just stunned, you know, like how introspective he was, you know, and how grounded and zen and patient and kind and caring and accepting, you know, in so many different ways. I felt just blown away by what a person, at that time I didn't know much about him, but I was just blown away that a program like this existed, and even existed then, when it must have been even more groundbreaking that something like this was playing on television. And now, you know, it's a very calming thing in a world where things are really fast and people just want to spit it out what they have to say because they're worried you're not going to be paying attention for very long. And that didn't exist for this 30 minutes of television. And so I started watching it every day, you know, and it was meditative in some ways, you know. Yeah. And so I got to the point where I was like, this is really fascinating. And I wanted to know, what was Fred Rogers like? Did he make this show? Was he just a performer? Was he really like this? You know, was he some sort of, you know, was it going to be disappointing to me when I found out what he was like? And so I started to dig around and look in documentaries and interviews and books, whatever books existed, and discovered pretty quickly that Fred Rogers he was Mr. Rogers. Like that was him, you know, like, and at that point I was just so inspired that I felt like, and this was back in, you know, this was a while ago, so people were aware of
before the new movie, for instance. He's so out there right now in pop culture.
Right. So there's been this kind of resurgence of Mr. Rogers in pop culture, and there was no resurgence at the time. So I was just thinking like, wow, nobody's really talking about Mr. Rogers. I should try to do something new for myself. I should try to write a picture book biography on this wonderful man, his life, and his art that he created, and share it with people that aren't aware that this existed. And so it took me a long time to work up the nerve to do some nonfiction, because it was very new to me, and also to do a book about a personal hero of mine. You know, that was very daunting. And so when I finally got around to it, years had passed by, literal years. And then I realized that if I was going to do it the way that I wanted to do it, I needed to get on board with Fred Rogers Productions. There's a company that still lives on in his name. The company he started used to be called Family Communications. Then it was called Fred Rogers Company. Now it's called Fred Rogers Productions. And I knew that they would need to be involved, and in some respects legally, because they hold the copyrights and trademarks of all the characters that I would want to talk about and illustrate. And but I also wanted it to be legitimate. You know, I didn't want to do a book about a personal hero without contributing in some way the profits of the book and being able to work in a collaborative existence with the company, the legacy that he created. And I couldn't make the book that I wanted to make without their insight, their knowledge, and all of the permissions that I would need. So I reached out to them, and it took a bit of time to win them over. I think there was, again, this was still at a time when there wasn't a lot going on with Mr. Rogers, and I think they just, I don't know if they had, and also some of it was, you know, they're from television, I'm from children's books, so that we're not, you know, swimming in the same circles.
Right.
So they, you know, when I kept writing them and saying I'm a children's book author and illustrator, you know, that can mean anything, you know. And so I started to send them books, you know, and then I would start to get some response after I would show them, you know, these are, I'm a traditionally published, you know, I've done a lot of books. This is what my art looks like. And then around that time that we were starting to I started to feel like a little bit of a break. Wolf in the Snow won the Caldecott medal. So I sent them that book, and I felt like that was a real, like, it really turned the page in the whole thing for me, because I don't know, the Caldecott really, it holds a lot of weight, you know, so it really helped me. I think it helped them to understand who I was, the seriousness that I take in my art and in the work and the business that I'm in.
And research.
Research, yeah, the
and
research.
really research.
And the research, there was a lot of research that went into Wolf in the Snow. And so I think that really changed everything for me and with them. And then at that point, we were able to come together and work out, you know, contractually what needed to be done in order to bring me on, because there's only going to be one authorized. There are a couple other Fred Rogers biographies, picture book biographies, that are more about his life and sort of his childhood, but this one is more about it also details the events of his life and childhood, but it also weaves in the art that he created, the characters he created, the television program, and the message that it held, and messages that it held. So it's really completely comprehensive about the man himself and the work that he did, and it was exactly what I wanted to do, and it was the only way I was going to do it. So I'm really excited that it's finally out and I can share it with everyone. And it's been a long journey, and it's a really satisfying journey as well.
We are so excited to receive the art. And Nancy, I hope I did see your live question, so I really hope that answered a bit more about the process of that book for you. And Matt, I want to end sort of on the notes of Fred Rogers. So we all over the country and really the world, we are celebrating graduation today. And it certainly is a unique year to graduate as a senior, either high school or college. And while I'm sure there will be plenty of extraordinary speeches today and inspiring and whatnot, I'm curious, what do you think, in your very humble but informed opinion, what do you think Fred would say to the class of 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in sort of tumultuous times, obviously, right now. You know, aside from the whole the pandemic, you know, the way that sort of upended our lives. There's just been this long stretch of years that have been really divisive, and a lot of anger and dissension, and I think Fred Rogers, he wanted to battle, you know, fight back against a lot of those things, and try to find, you know, connective, try to find something that would make people realize that, you know, we're fighting about these little things, but somewhere deep down we're the same. You know, we're not that different. And one of my favorite quotes of his, and I think maybe this may have even been he gave, you know, several commencement speeches, and it's one of my favorite quotes. Let me actually look it up so I get it right. But it speaks a bit about, I mean, he spoke a lot about helping others, you know, not just thinking about yourself, not just protecting yourself, but thinking about how you might look out for and help someone else. But one of my favorite things that he said was about trying to overcome the obstacles of our differences, you know, and thinking about how trying to look more at commonality and kindness, the kindness that really does exist within us. And the quote is, "Our world hangs like a magnificent jewel in the vastness of space. Every one of us is a part of that jewel. And in the perspective of infinity, our differences are infinitesimal." So I think we forget, you know, how small all of this really is. You know, when you look at when you kind of do that thing where you're like, you look back and you pull back on the earth and you pull back on the universe and on the planets, and we've got to find a way to not let this negativity and anger break us and pull us apart so often. You know, it's really easy with social media to contribute to that and to think things are really terrible. But I think, you know, deep down, the human existence, the human connection is far deeper than the surface strife and the surface argument that exists, that we're witnessing right now. So I think we've just got to try to look back, pull back and try to find the good in us. And I think that's how we'll get through all of this.
Well, from the words of not only Mr. Fred Rogers, but Mr. Matthew Cordell, Matt, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. And again, please, if you are not familiar with Matt's books, go check them out. If you're not familiar with his art, head over to rmichelson.com, RMICHELSON. Matt, I just thank you so much for spending the morning with us. And gosh, I'm going to hope to see you at some point in the future in
Me too.
real life, actually physically together. But I also want to thank you because not only was that a beautiful quote to share from Fred Rogers, but I want to also thank you because I have found, especially in these trying times, that your books really do unite all of us. I would want to touch very quickly on Explorers as well, because in that book you did a marvelous job of presenting characters who come from all walks of life. You had different religions in it, different races, all walks of life, and you do a tremendous job at reminding us that really we're all just in it together. So thank you, and thank you for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us. We'll see you next week for another edition of One-on-One Live at 2. Matt, be well.
Same to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
We'll
Enjoy your
see you
weekend.
soon.